Capita envisions a future in which children and families can flourish. By prioritizing our youngest children, their families, and their communities, we have the potential to radically transform the fabric of our societies for the long term. In this series of Capita In Conversation, we talk to interviewees from around the world to hear their stories, knowledge, wisdom, and ideas on how to create child and family flourishing.
In this episode, Joe Waters talks to Jon Baron, president of the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy, to discuss the evolution and impact of evidence-based policymaking in the U.S. Jon shares his journey and insights on how government funding can prioritize programs proven to work, tackling social issues through a rigorous, data-driven approach. The conversation explores some of the challenges and the potential of this approach to address core issues fueling public frustration, paving the way for a more effective and accountable policy landscape.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this conversation with Jon Baron. Jon and I met probably a decade or so ago in a conference room in an office in Washington, D.C. I was at the Institute for Child Success, leading a team that was exploring the feasibility of using pay-for-success financing to expand the nurse-family partnership home visiting model in South Carolina by having the state of South Carolina pay for outcomes. And Jon had been a leader in the evidence-based policy space. He had highly rated the nurse-family partnership randomized controlled trials. And so my colleague, Megan Golden, and I went to sit down with Jon, and we've known each other since. So Jon, welcome to this conversation.
Thanks. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the invitation.
So I'd love to just start out, if we could, hearing a little bit about your background. You're currently the president of the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy. I would love to just hear how you got to this point.
Okay, so I'm not going to start in 1962. I'll start where it's relevant. I graduated from public policy school and law school. I worked for Congress for 5 years in a completely different policy area, something related to technology policy, small business technology policy. I worked in the Clinton administration. I worked at the Defense Department, again in technology policy. And then at the end of the Clinton administration, I had a period where I sort of had to figure out what to do next. And I made a career switch, and that was to launch a nonprofit organization, the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy, which I did in 2001. It was launched then as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization whose mission was to increase the effectiveness of government social spending in poverty reduction and education, other areas, through the use of rigorous evidence about what works. And one of the reasons I thought I could be successful about that, I knew something about research, social policy research at the time, but I also knew how the policy process worked. I'd worked on getting some major legislation through in Congress and in the Defense Department. So I knew how government worked. And I thought I could bring that, coupled with the research expertise, try to advance social policy based on evidence and try to get policy reforms enacted. During the Bush and Obama administrations, we got a number of what are called the tiered evidence initiatives enacted into law in home visiting and in other areas, a number of major pieces of legislation. One of our funders, the Arnold Foundation, invited us to join their foundation as the Evidence-Based Policy Division in 2015. We became major funders of rigorous evaluations, particularly randomized controlled trials of social programs designed to grow the number that are shown to work. That was our goal. We were trying to find things, do the testing, find things that work, and then expand them. And then I left Arnold to run for governor of Maryland in 2021. I was not successful. So just to be clear, you're not having this podcast with the governor of Maryland. But I did develop a good rapport. When you run for governor, you've done, Joe, you ran for public office, right?
I ran for the state house in South Carolina. Yeah. Yes.
Your experience may have been similar, but you get to know the other candidates pretty well. And I had a good rapport with Wes Moore, who became governor, who won the governor's race. And we connected after the election. We met with the Arnold Foundation, with the Lauren John Arnold of the major philanthropy about launching an evidence and evaluation initiative in Maryland that led to an initiative with the state of Maryland. And I relaunched the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy, this time focused not on the federal government, but on state and local government.
You know, I'm curious, just for our listeners who actually may not be familiar with this area, when you say evidence-based policy, what do you mean?
It's the idea that when the government spends money in education, in poverty reduction, in preventing crime, in all these areas of social policy, that the funding should be allocated toward programs that have been tested and shown to be effective, rigorously tested. And we can talk about that more if that's useful, but they should be tested and shown effective before they are scaled up in a major way.
So some people might assume that government's doing this already, maybe has even been doing it from time immemorial. So are they? Why does a coalition like yours need to exist?
Because government, contrary to what you just asserted, Joe, government does not do that, rarely does that. Typically, when government allocates social spending in education and many job training, many other areas, it does so, the money goes generally from the federal government to state governments and then to local governments, sometimes local school districts and so on, through funding formulas or other processes that give no weight to whether what is being funded is actually effective. As a colleague of mine once described it, it's a kind of a turn the crank process in most cases. So social programs that do have credible evidence of effectiveness, and I hope we can talk about some examples, do not get a leg up. They're not prioritized. They are generally not rewarded in this process, and they may never receive the funding that is needed to operate on a large scale where they could really benefit a lot of people and solve major social problems.
So many of the programs that government is currently funding or maybe has been funding since the New Deal or the Great Society, they're actually not evidence-based. They're actually not proven to be effective.
Yeah, now that doesn't mean they're not effective, but the way that most of them are set up is that they programs like Head Start, for instance, or the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, which funds a lot of job training. They fund a whole lot of different activities, different kinds of early childhood programs in the case of Head Start, different kinds of job training programs, different models and approaches. But generally, the funding is allocated in the way that I described, where the evidence about what is effective at the state and local level, which specific program models are effective, again, plays very little role in what actually gets funded.
So let's talk about then some of those programs that have been proven to be effective. So I mentioned one at the top, Nurse-Family Partnership. There are, of course, others and across a variety of policy areas. First of all, what are some of those, and are there commonalities between them that these rigorous evaluations have shown?
Well, let me talk about a specific area, job training for low-income individuals. There are a few programs there that have been found extremely effective. Perscolis is one example. Year Up is another example. They focus the training on industries that are fast-growing, like information technology or healthcare, where there's a great demand for well-paying jobs. They work very closely with local employers to design the training initiative so it meets the employer's needs, and the employers provide paid internships to the trainees. So it's a very tight relationship with the employer so it meets the actual needs of the job market. These programs have been shown to raise long-term earnings over a period of, even 5-10 years after the training occurs by about 25%, in some cases more. It moves low-income people into it's upward mobility. It moves them into the middle class. Getting back to our earlier point, these two programs, Year Up and Perscolis, they're funded almost entirely by philanthropy in this country. They receive less than 5% of their funding from government for the reasons we discussed. Government funding generally does not prioritize or reward this kind of evidence of effectiveness.
And let's talk about the political reasons for why that is. You ran for office. You were presumably hoping to do this in Maryland. But if I am a member of Congress and I find out that we're spending a lot of money on programs that maybe are not as effective as we might imagine, and very little money on the most effective programs, I would think that this would be, particularly for someone who wants to be fiscally responsible, this would be a political embarrassment, but it's not.
True. In part, I think it reflects a misunderstanding. When new programs are rolled out, when they say, oh, we're going to put more money into the schools or into this, these employment programs or so on, policymakers generally roll them out with an air of certainty that they're going to solve the problem, as if they are putting out money for a new highway. And if you put out the money for the new highway gets built. But when new social programs are rolled out, the idea that they're almost certain to produce the hoped for effect is actually almost the opposite of the truth. Surprisingly few new programs, when they're rigorously evaluated, are found to do better than the services that are all to really improve upon the services that are already available in the community. In other words, in the case of job training, to produce a gain in wages beyond what the workers would normally experience if they didn't participate in this particular job training program. This is true not just of social programs, it's also true in medicine. Only about 10 to 15% of medical treatments that look great in the laboratory, when they're actually tested in humans in rigorous studies, randomized clinical trials, are found to produce a meaningful improvement in human health. It's true in business also when rigorous evaluations are done. So there's not an understanding among policymakers that when you roll it out, it's not spending the money is very different from actually having an impact. And it underscores the importance of rigorous testing to find out which new programs do work, and then expanding those and revising government spending so that that process actually occurs.
So Jon, what is the history of this idea, right? So I'm thinking, for example, that in the New Deal, we were rolling out billions of dollars in new spending to stimulate the economy, lots of new social programs, everything from Works Progress Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, Social Security, another burst of activity in the 1960s with the Great Society. Were people like President Roosevelt and President Johnson thinking about effectiveness and evaluating these programs as they were rolling them out in those initial New Deal and Great Society eras?
In the New Deal, they were not. Now, for some programs like Social Security, you probably don't need a rigorous evaluation to say that it's effective, because even you can actually see the effect without any rigorous study. Right. The rate of poverty among the elderly has just declined dramatically. It used to be a major problem. It's much, much less of a problem now. For others, the goal of many of the Great Society programs was, to paraphrase Lyndon Johnson, it was to give people the skills they need, the education and the skills they need to succeed in the workforce, to be self-sufficient. Many of those programs, like Head Start and Job Corps, and there are a few others, but those that have been rigorously evaluated have unfortunately been found not to produce the hope for, sustained gains, meaningful improvements and long-term outcomes for program participants. That's from the Great Society. To the great credit of, the first rigorous evaluations, randomized controlled trials, started in the late 1960s, and the evaluations of Head Start and many welfare to work programs took place in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s. So eventually those were rigorously evaluated. There are some programs were found effective, but many were not. And in social spending, you can't just keep doing the same thing we've been doing for 50 years and expect a different result if we want to solve social problems. We need an evidence-based approach, one which really focuses on impact and effectiveness and channels resources in that way.
So once we find that, and I know that this also happens with defense spending, right? That, something is not needed or something is proven to not work or be effective, and yet money has been spent in a congressional district and constituencies develop, and then it becomes very difficult to dislodge something that we have been investing in for a number of years, but it's not necessarily effective. And, I think that there are a lot of people who say, well, those programs, they do some good in the community. They create a sense of social cohesion, or they, very crudely, they employ a handful of people or maybe even a great number of people who need that employment. So what do you say to about programs that have been proven to be ineffective? Should we just end them? Should we rip the Band-Aid off and not fund them any longer?
Well, I think there's a slightly different way of thinking about it. We worked very closely with the Obama administration, particularly in President Obama's first term, to get enacted into law a set of programs, some of them quite sizable, that allocated funding based on evidence of effectiveness, and thereby, here's the punchline, contained the seeds, the mechanism to evolve toward greater effectiveness over time. One of the examples I'm going to give is it was called the Investing in Innovation Fund. Then it was reauthorized by a Republican Congress called the Education, Innovation, and Research Program. It's about a $300 million program at the Department of Education. It funds all types of different programs in education, like many federal social programs. But the largest grants, the $50 million grants, go to programs that have strong evidence of effectiveness, along with the requirement for a rigorous evaluation to make sure they're still effective. Then the program funds many more programs, a much larger number, with more modest grants that have promising evidence, along with the requirement that they too be rigorously evaluated. If they're found effective, then they can move up to the top tier. And then it funds other programs that are more preliminary in nature, again, with a preliminary evaluation. The idea is you have a conveyor belt. You're building evidence, and then at the top tier, the $50 million grants, you're expanding it. That's a way in which evidence of effectiveness within each social program can be used to evolve that program toward greater effectiveness. In other words, more and more of the money over time goes to programs that have been demonstrated to have meaningful impact. One could imagine taking a program like Head Start or the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act or others, big social programs, and retrofitting them. Money's still going out the door, still same amount of social spending, but sort of building that mechanism that the money within that program is going to be allocated toward effectiveness into the machinery of how it allocates funds, into the grant-making criteria.
Now, Jon, is it possible too that some programs are evolving to less effectiveness, right? So I'm thinking in particular about how the social situation may change, right? The social situation for which the program was originally created, and they may be less effective as a result. The Nurse-Family Partnership trial in South Carolina, none of the outcomes for the Pay for Success project were achieved.
Right.
I have a theory about why that might be the case. And I think, what I would suggest is public health messaging and other things have really sort of caught up with what NFP was doing very effectively in the 1970s, especially around moms smoking during pregnancy and its effect on low birth weights and so forth. So I'm just curious then to hear your thoughts on, how programs, if programs might evolve to less effectiveness and how they can remain relevant using the research analysis that's done in RCTs.
I think what you just described underscores the importance of continuing to evaluate, because you're right, things can change over time. In the case of the Nurse-Family Partnership, the more recent studies are also, they're much larger, both the federal evaluation and also the evaluation in South Carolina are much larger and more definitive than the earlier studies. I think there still is some promise with the Nurse-Family Partnership. We're still awaiting some of the results from those studies, particularly the federal one. So we'll see. But I think our loyalty has to be toward solving the problem and not toward a particular program or approach. So it does underscore the need, I think, for continuing to evaluate over time and adjusting course based on the results.
So that leads very nicely to my next question, which is this loyalty to effectiveness, to scientific rigor. To be quite honest with you, it seems to me like it's from another era of our political culture in America, very pre-2016 era. We're now living in an era that is much more populist. I think we can all agree that there's a lot less loyalty, at least from national candidates, to what works, to scientific rigor, to effectiveness. We're just no longer in a sort of age of technocratic politics in the United States. So what might the future of evidence-based policymaking in the United States look like?
Well, a couple things. There has been, looking at social spending over the past 50 years in the United States, you can look at the numbers and say reading and math achievement, which is quite mediocre overall, there are variations in it, but it has not changed much in the United States as measured by the National Assessment of Educational Progress over the last 30, 40 years. Despite a whole lot of different things, No Child Left Behind and, Race to the Top and all sorts of things that have been tried. The example that I gave of tiered evidence programs, they exist. They're a tiny piece, really, of what the federal government funds. However, there has been a lot of progress, Joe, on the evidence building side. There aren't a huge number of programs, but there are now some more programs. I gave 2 examples, Perscolis and Year Up, but there are others. There's one we are expanding in Maryland in a partnership with the governor's office and Arnold Ventures called Saga Tutoring program for 9th graders, intensive tutoring. It's been shown to move kids ahead in high poverty schools by almost a full grade level by the end of 9th grade. And then that effect is sustained 2 years later. And these are big, conclusive trials, 3 trials in New York City and Chicago, all showing sizable effects. On the evidence building side, the number of programs where you can say with high confidence that they work and they really improve people's lives in a very significant way is much higher than it used to be. There's more challenges on the evidence building side, but the real challenge now is to try to re-engineer government so that it uses that evidence. And that's what we're trying to do in Maryland and other states. Now, on your larger question of, well, there's all this populism and so on, a lot of the populism, I believe, I don't have a study to prove it, is due to the fact that we have not been making progress on poverty and education. And, the bottom 40% of the population hasn't seen a meaningful rise in wages for nearly 40 years. While incomes at the very top have exploded. So I think a lot of the populism is just frustration that things are not improving. Some areas we've gone backward. We're in the worst drug epidemic in American history. Some things have improved. Violent crime has come way down. But overall, I think a lot of the populism derives from the fact we're not getting anywhere. Didn't used to be this way in the country. Not after World War II. There was a sense, the rising tide was lifting all boats. So evidence-based policy potentially offers a path to progress that could really address what people are yearning for.
That's really interesting. I've not heard it articulated that way, that actually a deeper commitment to evidence-based policymaking might be a way through the populism of the moment. Really, some of the legitimate grievances, a way to address some of the legitimate grievances that many Americans have. So, Jon, just two more questions here. The first is, as you know, I have spent much of my career focused on how investing in the earliest years of human life is evidence-based, it's effective, because that is when the vast majority of brain development happens in a person's life that sets the stage not only for lifelong good lifelong educational outcomes, but also good lifelong health outcomes. That space, the 0 to 8 space, is held to a very rigorous standard of evidence. I think it is often the case that we're having to make the case for a return on investment in high quality evidence-based early childhood programs. I have never once heard a school superintendent stand in front of the legislature and have to make a case for the return on investment from 12th grade. What accounts for the difference there?
I do think in K-12 education, it may not be framed as return on investment. Sometimes it is, but there is also increasingly a focus on, is this an effective program? Is this a cost-effective program? And there are efforts, as someone who reads studies for a living and for a hobby, there are many attempts to sort of quantify a rate of return on a lot of different programs, whether it's job training for young adults or youth programs to prevent crime or K-12 education programs. So I think I do think that people are asking, what is the long-term benefit, and does it exceed the cost across many different policy areas?
Last question. I ask the same last question every time, Jon. So here it is. What is one project, personal or professional, that you've dreamed of but haven't started yet?
Well, can I describe one that I've kind of recently started?
Sure.
So we have a project with the state of Maryland that was a partnership with Governor Wes Moore and his team, as well as with Arnold Ventures, that my organization is facilitating and helped to launch, where Arnold is putting in $20 million as an incentive for state and local governments in Maryland to expand some of these proven programs that I've been discussing that have been shown to have large impacts on people's lives. like the Saga tutoring program is one example. We're trying to get the ASAP program in community colleges expanded. This is just getting underway, but the commitment from Arnold Ventures is there. We're working with the governor's office. We've gotten some good traction. We're going to be making some announcements soon about what programs are going to be expanded. Because, Joe, it is trying to address the problem that I described earlier, which is that social spending typically is allocated through formulas and other processes that pay very little attention to evidence about what works. This is a way of using philanthropy to incentivize government in government spending to focus funding on these programs that are at the very top of the evidence tier, that have definitive evidence of large improvements in people's lives. The other piece is that we're working with government agencies that agree to do this kind of partnership, the match funding piece. They also, as part of this process, agree to work with our organization to write into future funding announcements, government funding announcements, a priority for the use of evidence and for rigorous testing, so that once the philanthropic money goes away, this focus on evidence becomes sustained and institutionalized. So on the evidence use front, getting government to actually use the evidence that is out there, that's something that I'm really excited about. We're looking at expanding it to other states as well. It's, at least from my standpoint, it's the next chapter. At least it's the next chapter for me in evidence-based policy.
Super. Jon Baron, thanks so much for your time today.
Well, Joe, thank you for yours. Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it. If you let me, as my wife will tell you, I could talk all day about evidence-based policy.
We can do another one. We can always do another one.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jon. It's good to see you.
That's great. Thanks again for the invitation. This was fun. It's great to reconnect with you.
Likewise. Take care.
Each episode of Capita In Conversation is produced by Michael Bettis and is available by podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as capita.org.